Hey guys, welcome back to another video. My name's Regan and this is Regan Writes. So today we're going to be doing a cute little video for Halloween. I wanted to do like a tier list for all of the horror slash thriller books that I've read. I mean, technically I have read some other books that could be categorized as thrillers, but I've just done more horror thriller than just straight up thriller, because some thrillers are more of like a mystery and they aren't really scary or like spooky or anything like that, so I've just gone for like the most horror slash thriller books. So as you can see, there's a lot of Stephen King on this list because mostly I've read Stephen King books when it comes to horror and thriller, but there are some other things on here, some like classic horror, some more like thrillery horror. Let me explain the tier list. So at the top we've got Bloody Fantastic. Okay, I know it's cringy, right? But it's Halloween and I wanted to do like Halloween themed, horror themed tier lists, and they're all Stephen King like puns. Apart from the top one, the top one's just kind of random. So we've got Bloody Fantastic at the top, so that's like top tier horror thriller books. And then below that we've got Overlooked, which is obviously a play on Overlook, the Overlook Hotel from The Shining. And those books are kind of books that I think are really good, that maybe don't get talked about all that much, and I think they deserve a little bit more attention. And then we have Go to Your Closet and Pray, which is, I mean, I'm paraphrasing with that one, from Carrie. It's when her mother, basically, because her mother's obviously really religious, so she's like, go to your closet and pray, when Carrie's done something that she doesn't like. So yeah, that's kind of the tier for books that are like, I think they're good, but they could definitely be better, so they need to go to the closet and pray for forgiveness, and maybe they could be a little bit better. But yeah, so that's that tier. And then we've got Floating in the Sewers for Pennywise. So this is like bottom of the barrel in my opinion, and there's only actually going to be one book in this, spoiler alert. And yeah, so I'm just going to shuffle around some of the things here. So I've rearranged the list a little bit just to break it up so it's not like loads of Stephen King all at the same time. So we're going to start off with Carrie by Stephen King. Now this is the first Stephen King book that I ever read, and it's also Stephen King's debut novel. And so I didn't even know that going into it when I first read it. I read it when I was like 14 years old, I think, 13, 14, so I was around the same age as Carrie, like young teenager in school. I'm going to put this in Go to Your Closet and Pray. And the reason I've put it in Go to Your Closet and Pray is because this isn't a perfect book by any means. It's not amazing. It's not the best Stephen King book that I've ever read. It's definitely not bad. I've read worse books, but it's not amazing. I mean, the cultural impact of Carrie is unquestionable. You know, like everybody knows the scene where the bucket of blood falls on her head at prom and she starts killing all of the people in the school and like snaps. So, I mean, you can't really deny the cultural impact of it. However, the book itself, there are a few things about it that I see a lot of people complain about. Mostly the format of the book, because, I mean, I've not read this book for a long time, but I believe it's told through interviews and stuff like that, rather than like it's kind of interspersed with interviews from people. I haven't read the book in such a long time, but I think that's the reason why people don't really like it. I didn't have a problem with the format, to be honest. I thought it was fine. Again, I don't really have much of an issue with the book. I think it's just okay. The stuff that I did like about the book, though, is I liked a lot of the like psychic stuff, because I always find that fun, especially telekinesis. That's my favorite superpower, if you didn't know. I was eating up all of the telekinesis and stuff like that, the way she's like getting her power, and then she just like lets loose and lashes out at the end. I thought that was really cool. And when I read it in school, I don't want to say I was bullied in school, because I wasn't like constantly bullied, but like people did pick on me now and then, and it was like a bit of a shit place to be sometimes, and so I could sympathize with Carrie in that way. And so for some people they might find this book horrific. For some people they might find it to be like kind of a satisfying power fantasy where she gets back at her bullies. Obviously she takes it a little bit too far, to the point where it's like terrorism. But anyways, let's move on to the next one. So we got Frankenstein next, which is a classic horror. Technically it's science fiction, but I think it gets lumped in with horror enough to the point, like Frankenstein's Monster is like a horror icon, so I feel like we can do Frankenstein. So Frankenstein, I'm going to put Frankenstein in Bloody Fantastic. Now I think some people might have an issue with that. That might be a controversial opinion, because I know a lot of people say that Frankenstein is one of those books that they had to read in school, and so it made them absolutely hate classics. It made them hate this book in general, and even reading, which is unfortunate, but when I read it, I didn't have to read it for school or study it or anything like that. I can see why it'd be that kind of book that you have to study in school, but when I read it, I really enjoyed it actually. I wasn't expecting to like it as much as I did. I thought it was just going to be like, I didn't really know much about Frankenstein going into it. Obviously I knew Frankenstein's Monster from, like, you know, everywhere, but as a story I didn't really know what the story was about or what actually happened in it. And so it was a nice surprise when I read it, and I was like, oh, alright. So for me, what I enjoyed most about Frankenstein was the philosophical things that were talked about in the book, what it means to be human, and wanting to kind of belong to a society that rejects you, and just the all over like moody gothic vibes, and then like the deep sad tragedy of it all about Frankenstein's monster wanting to just be a part of society, wanting to belong, wanting to have friends and loved ones, and every time he kind of starts to show himself to people, they're terrified by him, they reject him, because obviously he's like a monster, he's just human parts that have been brought back to life basically, and so people reject him and it just makes him feel like shit, and he's like, you know what, fuck you guys, I'm not even gonna try anymore. And then he gets very vengeful at the end and wants to kill his creator for making him go through and suffer the torment he's had to go through ever since he was brought to life basically. The only complaints I might have about Frankenstein are that it can be maybe a little bit slow at times and difficult to get through just from the writing style, just because it is quite an old book. So it's definitely different from a lot of contemporary work, because it was written like, I don't know how many years ago, I'll put somewhere on the screen. Either way, I really enjoyed Frankenstein, so it's going there. And next we have Stephen King's Cycle of the Werewolf. Now this is going in Go to Your Closet and Pray, because this could have been a better book, but I don't think it was ever going to be a better book than what it is, because it's basically like a glorified calendar. Because if you don't know, the book basically is quite a short book. I read it in one sitting. It's perfect for Halloween night. That's when I read it last year. Halloween night, you can easily read this book in one night, so I would recommend reading it on Halloween if you are going to read it, just for the vibes. But it's basically set out like each chapter is a different month of the year, so something happens at the start, and from that point you kind of get a snippet from each month and what's been happening each full moon when the werewolf attacks this little town. But I mean, overall it's a pretty predictable, not super special book. I'd say I will give it credit where credit is due when it comes to the artwork. The artwork in the book is fantastic. That's kind of why you'd get this book, because of the art and the illustrations. It's a very good, very well illustrated book, but the story itself is just very lackluster. There's not really much to it. It's very predictable, like I say, it's by the book. It's a typical werewolf story, like it's nothing special really. So Stephen King's It. Now this is a juggernaut of a book. I'm gonna put this above Frankenstein, thank you. I feel like I don't really need to say much about it. It's self-explanatory. It's probably Stephen King's most well-recognized, well-known works. Most people, I would say, in some capacity grew up with it, whether it's the newer generation with the new remakes of the films that just came out, or back in the 90s with the miniseries and the book itself. Generations and generations have grown up with this story being like one of the scariest things that you're first introduced to as like a young adult, teenager, even a child, which might be a bit too young. So what I liked about it is I loved how insane it was. Like, I did not realize going into it how off the walls it went, because I have seen the film, both of the films, and I've seen the mini-series adaptations, and neither of them even scratch a lot of the stuff that happens in the book. Obviously, because the book's like over 1,000 pages long, then they're just not gonna be able to cover everything. But I don't think they even scratched the surface on like a lot of the crazy, wacky stuff that happens in the book. Like, there are just so many little scenes that are in the book that you read for the first time when you don't know anything about them, and you're like, what the fuck is going on? especially the ending. For the entire like last section of the book, I was just like, what is happening? This is insane. The whole ritual of Chud and like the like space turtle and the whole town flooding and the fight with it at the end, like it was just crazy. It's not even comparable to the films and miniseries. Like it's just way better than them. And I loved the films when they first came out. I thought they were fantastic, but I think after reading the book, it kind of ruined the films a little bit for me, just because the book is like, there's just so much more in there. The characters for the most part are really well developed. They have like a strong backstory. Each of them has their own strong backstory and story throughout the book and character arc. Even side characters. Obviously the villain, Pennywise, or it, a phenomenal villain. The way it like plays with its food and how it interacts with characters and how it presents itself, and it's just such a creative villain. Like Stephen King was very creative with it, with Pennywise, and really did not hold back on like the gore and the horrific nature of this creature. Like it's just such an amazing creature design and villain in general as a concept. The embodiment, the like very embodiment of fear. And also how messed up the book is. Like there's a lot of stuff that happens in this book that's like really dark, really messed up. The whole fridge thing, if you know, you know, with Patrick, that whole scene with the fridge and his little brother, like what? And then like I can't remember exactly, but there's like this scene where this kid sees the creature from the Black Lagoon or something like that. It like comes out of the little stream and like chases after him, and I'm pretty sure it eats his head off. Like there's just a lot of really dark stuff in this book. And lest we forget the thing that happens at the end, which we don't really need to go into detail about that, but yeah, that was an interesting idea, Stephen. That was an interesting idea. I feel like that was a bit overdone. I feel like that could have been cut down a little bit. We didn't need as much detail as we got. It was a bit much. But so on to the next one, we've got Red Dragon. I'm going to put this in overlooked because I feel like no one really talks about this. Even when it comes to the film, like no one really talks about the film, no one really talks about the book. But this is the book that introduced the world to Hannibal Lecter, which is one of the biggest, most recognizable villains in history. Like he's a classic horror icon. Again, this book's more of a thriller than a horror, but there are definitely horror aspects to the book. The stuff I liked about this book was the back and forth between Will and Hannibal, whilst Will is trying to, you know, solve this crime and figure out who this murderer is and stop him before he kills anybody else, and how Hannibal kind of plays with him, and like Hannibal's having fun the whole time while Will's trying to like solve this murder, and he's just like, oh, the back and forth, the dialogue, it's just very juicy, very good. And I also enjoyed the fact that you get to kind of see more of the villain's backstory, not Hannibal Lecter, but the actual villain of the story, the main villain, the Red Dragon. But I liked seeing how he became a killer and how he got messed up by his grandmother and his whole past, and how he was like abused as a child, and that's really messed him up as an adult, and he's never obviously gotten help for that, and he thinks he's like deformed because he's got a cleft lip or something, but he thinks he's this deformed, horrible, ugly beast. And his whole relationship with Reba, I think her name is, which is his like love interest who he gets close to, and how she's blind and so she can't see him for what he thinks he is and what he thinks he looks like. Yeah, it's just a very interesting look on how a serial killer can become a serial killer, what happens in the past to make them who they are. Obviously it doesn't excuse it, but it's just interesting looking into the backstory of a serial killer, what makes them that way. So next, let's move on to The Mist. So The Mist is technically a short story, and it's part of a short story collection by Stephen King. I can't remember the name of the short story collection off the top of my head. I'll put it on the screen somewhere. I'm going to put this in Go to Your Closet and Pray, but I'm going to definitely put it at the top of that list. I mean, I really enjoyed The Mist. I don't really have many issues with the book itself. The concept, I loved the idea of this mist, this like extra dimensional fog that just rolls into town, and it brings with it all of these like Lovecraftian creatures that are gigantic and otherworldly and just very odd and strange and extremely deadly. I love a good creature feature, and so that's very much the vibe that you get from this book. I mean, I'm pretty sure Stephen King was inspired by stuff like classic horror B-movies when he wrote this, and that definitely shows. And I also like how confined the story is, because it is pretty much for the most part confined to a supermarket where a bunch of people are trapped inside and they're trying to like figure out what to do and what's going on. And I also liked how the people in that confined space, kind of like tribalism starts to take over and people start rallying against other people, and there's like infighting and all of this other stuff. Mrs. Carmody, the like super religious crazy lady that is like spouting all of this stuff about how like what's going on is biblical and it's like God's punishment to us, and all of that stuff was really interesting. The only real issue that I have with the book is the fact that it's not as fleshed out as I would have liked it to be, which makes sense because it is only a short story. It's pretty short, it's a quick read. It's longer than something like Cycle of the Werewolf though. I mean, you could read The Mist in one day if you really wanted to, but it took me a few days to read it. But I feel like it could have done with a bit more fleshing out, especially with the characters. And also when it comes to the ending, I feel like the ending is very divisive. People either like the book ending or the movie ending, because they're polar opposites. In the book, it's a lot more hopeful. I won't say exactly what happens just in case you want to experience it for yourself, but the ending of the book is a lot more hopeful, whereas the ending of the movie is extremely tragic and dark and not hopeful at all. I mean, I guess kind of in a way. Overall, it is, but when it comes to certain characters, definitely not. So yeah, and I don't know, I preferred the ending of the movie a little bit more. I can understand why you'd enjoy or why you'd prefer the ending of the book version of The Mist, but for me, I'd still say that the movie kind of the movie just makes me care about the characters a bit more, I feel like, because the characters in the book, especially the main guy, is kind of unlikable. Like, he cheats on his wife. He doesn't seem to be that great of a dad. I can't really remember too much, but like, he doesn't seem like that great of a guy. Like, he's not a very likable protagonist. I remember just thinking, I just remember not really being very attached to him, finding him to be a bit of a dick, and just not really getting attached to him, whereas in the film he's a lot more likable. You can kind of root for him a bit more. And I like that in the film they took out the part where he cheats on his wife, because they're trapped in stuff like a couple of days and he's like, oh, I'll just cheat on my wife. Like, sir, are we okay? Calm down. Like, I know that it's a very like stressful situation and sometimes you just need to like relieve some of the tension, but that's just not the way you do it. Like, when your kid's there with you and your wife's possibly back at home, maybe still alive, why are we cheating? Like, make it make sense. Have a bit of restraint. But so next we've got Pet Sematary. So this is going at the top, it's going in between those two. So Pet Sematary for me is one of my favorite Stephen King books, as well as It. I think it's an amazing book when it comes to dealing with issues of trauma, especially when it comes to death and grief. I think it handles the feelings of grief and what happens when a very close loved one dies, especially a child. I think it handles those subjects really well and makes you feel those emotions, and it really puts you in the shoes of the protagonist. And let me smack your shit about. I think Stephen King's really good at that overall, to be honest. In a lot of his books he's really good at tapping into not only people's fears but also people's emotions and thoughts and feelings that I feel like you don't get from a lot of other authors, and that's very much the case for Pet Sematary. I can't really think of anything that I dislike about it either, so we're just gonna leave it like that. Next up we have Rosemary's Baby, another kind of modern classic horror. Never seen the film, but I have read the book, and the book is fantastic. I'm actually gonna put it in overlooked just because I don't think it'd be for everyone, maybe. Nor do I think it's like the best book ever written, but when I first read it, it was actually my favourite horror book that I'd ever read. This was before I'd read much of Stephen King's other stuff like Pet Sematary, Salem's Lot, The Shining, all that stuff. All I'd read by that point, I think, was Carrie and maybe a couple of his other books. I really enjoyed Rosemary's Baby. It's a very concise, to the point book. It doesn't really spend too much time floundering in the plot or overly long exposition or dialogue scenes or unnecessary scenes to like pad it. It's quite a short book, and so it's easy to read. It's very fast paced. It's also very creepy, like it's a really creepy book. The only complaints I have about it would be maybe some of the things in the book didn't age super well. I can't remember what, because I was checking through my Goodreads reviews because I can't really remember, honestly, reading some of these books. I remember reading them and like certain scenes here and there, but I don't remember the books overall, so I had to kind of go back and look at old reviews. And so apparently in my review I put that some of the things that happen in the book are a little bit outdated, or maybe didn't age so well. I'm not 100% sure what I was talking about, but there you go. And it also wasn't super scary to me. I think if you're scared by devil stuff or witchcraft or culty stuff, then you'll maybe be scared by it. But for me personally, none of those things bother me. It wasn't super scary to me, but it was definitely creepy and disturbing, and there are some scenes that are like, ooh, okay. Yeah, I would recommend this book. I think it is a little bit overlooked. No one really talks about the book all that much. People talk about the film when it comes to horror films, but not really the book. My throat's killing and I've only got like 10 minutes of camera space left, so I need to like kind of push through these last ones. Okay, let's speedrun a few of these. Salem's Lot. I'm gonna put this in overlooked, definitely near the top end. It could be in bloody fantastic, to be honest. It's actually one of my favourite Stephen King books. Why is it not? There we go. It's actually one of my favourite Stephen King books. And it's not that I think it's necessarily overlooked. I think it does get talked about enough, but I think more so in the Stephen King community, like fan community, but I think overall when it comes to horror it is a little bit overlooked. But what I found with this book, what I really liked about it, was that every time I put it down I wanted to pick it back up again. Like I didn't want to put it down. I was really invested in the story. It was like a real page turner for me. The vibes were there, like it was like all the spooky vibes. I would definitely recommend reading this around October time, like I did. It hits a lot of those like Halloween-y vibes. It's just a really cozy, I don't know if cozy is the right word because of some of the things that happen in the book, but like it's creepy. It's the type of book that you can just kind of snuggle up with in bed and just like read it for hours and hours and hours. So on to the next one, we've got The Shining. I mean, do I put it above Pet Sematary? I think the reading experience for me, I did enjoy The Shining a bit more because I also listened to the audiobook whilst reading it physically and kind of interspersed the audiobook with the physical reading, and so I think that made it a bit more atmospheric for me. I mean, the book overall is very atmospheric anyway. There are some scenes that happen in the book that don't happen in the film. There are actually quite a few scenes, but one of them that really surprised me with how creepy it was the topiary scene, and if you know, you know, but it's basically these hedge animals come to life, and it's just, it doesn't sound creepy, but when you're reading it, you're like, oh, okay. Like, it is really creepy, which is a testament to Stephen King's ability to make things that aren't necessarily creepy a lot more creepy than they actually are. He's really good at doing that. Next we have Dracula, put it in the bin. Floating in the Sewers with Pennywise. This is the only book that's going in that list, in that tier. Where do we even begin? Now, I enjoyed the whole metaphor in the beginning, well, not in the beginning, but the overall metaphor in the book of like sexual repression and how in that time period it was very demonized. Like sexuality in general was very demonized. It was seen as this thing that shouldn't really be talked about or expressed openly. It was a very sexually repressed time, and so Dracula is kind of like the embodiment of sexuality, and how he's like infesting civilized society with his like perverse nature. So I enjoyed all of that, and the first maybe like half of the book I also enjoyed for the most part, but once it hits that middle part, from that until the end, it's just so boring. It drags so bad. It was so slow for me. It took me months to read it just because of how slow it was. I kept putting it down and being like, I just don't want to pick it up. I just felt it was very anticlimactic as well. We spent all this time like basically hunting for these boxes of dirt, and then it just ends. Like they find Dracula, kill him, and then it's over. And it's like, oh, okay, cool. But I mean, for the first half, it's very like the vibes are there. It's very gothic, and then after the first half, it just kind of goes downhill there for me. I gave this 2 stars, and it's just I would never read it again. Next, we have The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. Definitely overlooked. It was an unexpected book for me, and in how much I liked it, because it's basically about a little girl that gets lost in a forest and she has to survive and try and get out. Like, it's a very simple concept, but Stephen King does so much to make it, to put you in her shoes and to make you feel the things she's feeling. And there's a lot of really like genuinely scary stuff. Like there's that one scene where I forget exactly what happens, but she's like confronted for the first time by this creature that may or may not actually be real. It may just be her imagination, but it also might be real, and it's like lurking in the forest watching her. Like that was a really creepy scene, and there's a few scenes like that are really creepy. And I think that Stephen King just does an amazing job of making a very simple story very scary. My only complaints could possibly be like the fact that it is maybe a little bit slow at times, but even that's a push. Overall, I'd say it's a really good book. So next up we have Silence of the Lambs. So this is the sequel to Red Dragon, so it's one of the Hannibal Lecter books, the more well-known of the series. I'm gonna put this in Bloody Fantastic. I think this is a classic. I'm actually gonna put it above Pet Sematary. No, I'll put it below Pet Sematary. But it's a very, very good book. I'd say if you want a book that's very close to the movie adaptation or TV show adaptation, read Silence of the Lambs. If you enjoyed the film, you will enjoy the book. They're pretty much like identical. There are obviously more things in the book just because it's longer. It has more room to add stuff in, so it's a bit more fleshed out than the film, but it's very, very close to the film. So if you enjoyed the film, you'll enjoy the book. In my review for this, I wrote that it was akin to a good comfort food. So every time I sat down to read it, it was just like, I don't know, it was just so comforting and like juicy, and you could really delve into it, and it wasn't too heavy or anything like that. It was like you could just enjoy it. Like it's a really good, enjoyable book. It's also relatively fast-paced and easy to read, and the dialogue between Starling and Lecter was just, again, a lot like Red Dragon with Will and Lecter. It's the dialogue between those two is really well written and a great example of what good dialogue can look like. And also the villain, Buffalo Bill, great villain, and the whole chase where Clarice is trying to figure out what's going on and find out who the killer is before he can strike again, a lot like with the Red Dragon. Yeah, overall, really great book. Finally, we've got Misery. I'm gonna put Misery in Bloody Fantastic. Again, this is like another classic. I'm actually gonna put this... Ooh, I'm gonna put this there because I didn't enjoy reading it as much as Silence of the Lambs, but it is a really good book. The book's really well written. You can really feel the protagonist's pain. Annie is an incredible villain. We all know Kathy Bates did an amazing job portraying her in the film, and in the book you get even more of that. She's even crazier in the book. It's also a very brutal story as well. Like some of the stuff that happens is really brutal, and all throughout the book the stakes constantly rise. It gets more and more tense. The only thing I didn't really like about the book was the book within the book. So obviously Annie's trying to get Paul to write or rewrite the latest Misery book, and so you get excerpts from that book, and those were the only parts that I was kind of like, I could skip this. But besides that, everything else was amazing. So yeah, that's the tier list all in all. Most of them in Bloody Fantastic. I hope you enjoyed this video. God, this is 45 minutes. I can't wait to edit this. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like, and if you haven't already, please subscribe if you want to, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!